while here. Before there were bricks to build a crematoria during the Holocaust, and before there were armies to carry out Hitler's nefarious plans, words were the first weapon in Hitler's arsenal against the Jewish people. It was in the wake of the Holocaust that the United Nations was founded to save succeeding generations, and this is in their mission, from the scourge of war and uphold and protect the dignity and worth of every person. The definition of genocide under the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide includes a prohibition on conspiracy to commit genocide, as well as direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Article 4 of the Convention provides that individuals committing any of the listed crimes of genocide shall be punished, quote, whether they are constitutional responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals, end quote. Yet, we have a leader, so-called leader like Ahmadinejad, who has consistently called for the destruction of the Jewish state of Israel with virtual impunity. On October 26, 2005, at the World Without Zionism conference in Tehran, Ahmadinejad called for Israel, as we all know, to be wiped off the map, described Israel as a disgraceful blot on the face of the Islamic world, and declared that anyone who recognizes Israel will burn in the fire of the Islamic nation's fury. On December 12, 2006, Ahmadinejad addressed a conference in Tehran questioning the historical veracity of the Holocaust and said that Israel would soon be wiped out. On Israel's 60th birthday, Ahmadinejad gave a speech in which, according to the official Iranian news agency, he stated that Israel was on its way to destruction. In a public address which aired on the Iranian news channel on June 2, 2008, Ahmadinejad stated again, called for this worm of corruption in reference to Israel to be wiped out. Not only has he made clear his intent, stating that while some may say that the idea of a greater Israel has expired, I say the idea of a lesser Israel has expired too. He also called the Holocaust a fake and accused Israel of perpetuating a Holocaust on Palestinians. Yet Ahmadinejad is hardly alone in this incendiary rhetoric. On December 15, 2000, the Iranian Supreme Leader, Khamenei, stated to thousands of Muslim worshippers in Tehran that Iran's stance has always been clear on this ugly phenomenon, which is Israel. We have repeatedly said that this cancerous tumor of a state should be removed and must be removed from the region. The Congress has repeatedly adopted resolutions denouncing the Iranian regime, its belligerent rhetoric, its behavior, and urging responsible nations to hold Tehran accountable and prevent it from achieving its horrific goals. It is against this backdrop that I would like to briefly discuss with you Congress's wider role, not only in actively confronting the Iranian regime, but also addressing the totality of the Iranian threat and the corrupt organizations that the United Nations, the very body created out of the ashes of the Second World War, has become. The threat of the Iranian regime and the threat that it poses to the United States, to Israel, and to the world is clear. It is stark and it is growing. The greatest danger of all is its effort over several decades to build a nuclear weapon. Iran continues to reject the resolutions of the United Nations Security Councils calling on it to suspend its uranium enrichment program, and it continues to make progress on its nuclear program, as evidenced by the recent report of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And Iran is also developing long-range ballistic missiles that could carry nuclear warheads. Just this past Saturday, just a few days ago, the head of the inspections in the Middle East for the International Atomic Energy Agency showed IAEA member nations a series of documents, a series of photographs, indicating that Iran had tried to modify their long-distance missiles to carry a nuclear payload. Now Iran's missiles can already strike U.S. forces and our allies in Europe and in the Middle East, and it's only a matter of time until it has has the capacity to hit us anywhere. Equally important, though often overlooked, is its status as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism and its cynical use of terror to advance its interests. The clerical regime is fomenting bloodshed and promoting chaos in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the Persian Gulf, as well as in Iraq, where it is actively assisting in the killing of our soldiers. It also appears to be embarking upon a strategy to use its Islamic terrorist proxies not only throughout the region, not only in places like Afghanistan, but actually in Africa and even in Latin America. Tehran has already established an expanding presence in Latin America and in Africa, embracing political, economic, and military ties, as well as engaging in activities such as money laundering and acquiring weapons-related materials. More worrying is the possibility that the Islamic Republic might decide to use these footholds to destabilize other states or to launch terrorist attacks against innocent civilians abroad. One need look no further than the 1994 bombings of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires to not only understand Iran's reach half a world away, but to recognize its intent, not just to target Israelis, but Jewish communities everywhere. My perspective, and one that is shared by many of my colleagues, is to impose a cost so high that it threatens the regime's survival unless it changes course. That will require imposing immediate, comprehensive, tough economic sanctions, along with every other source of pressure that we can muster, and do so in coordination with as many countries as we can persuade to do so. We can also impose pressure through such measures as publicly investigating financial institutions operating in the U.S. that are reported to be in violation of U.S. laws or UN Security Council resolutions regarding Iran. Congress can also help to ensure that those institutions which have cut off or curtailed their dealings with the Iranian regime, including refusing to issue new letters of credit to Iranian businesses, are rewarded. Where is the incentive for them to do so? Congress can support the growing effort to persuade pension funds to divest from companies that invest in Iran, which is aimed at persuading companies operating in Iran to rethink the wisdom of doing business with one of our nation's most dangerous enemies. Sanctions are among the most effective sources of pressure we have, but we have not used them to their full potential. Unfortunately, there are current efforts underway in the United States Senate to move a bill by my friend Senator Chris Dodd, which actually weakens rather than strengthens current U.S. sanctions against the Iranian regime. Sanctions that were codified or made permanent by the Iran Freedom Support Act, which I authored and which was enacted into law in September of 2006. Movement of the Dodd bill this week, at the same time that Ahmadinejad is to appear before the United Nations General Assembly, would have a crippling effect on our efforts to use economic leverage to compel Iran to dismantle its programs. I have sought to strengthen the existing sanctions of the Iran Sanctions Act, beginning in 2005 with the Iran Freedom Support Act. Last year, I joined my dear friend, the late chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Lantos, and the ambassador and I were just talking about him, as the lead Republican in authoring H.R. 1400, the Iran Counterproliferation Act, which passed the House with a vote of 397 to 16. This legislation strengthens the Iran Sanctions Act along with other bilateral and multilateral efforts. More recently, I introduced H.R. 6178, the Security Through Termination of Proliferation Act, or STOP, which seeks to ensure that nations like the United Arab Emirates do more to ensure that they are not transshipping illegal goods that are going to or coming from Iran. Among other provisions, the bill would amend the Iran, North Korea, and Syria Non-Proliferation Act to apply sanctions to persons involved in the transshipment of certain goods, services, and technology. And the reaction of the United Nations to these blatant provocations has been muted at best and non-existent at worst. Yet this reaction should not surprise us when the United Nations has yet to adequately address its own anti-Israel and anti-Semitic legacy, one that has become pervasive in many United Nations bodies and its affiliated agencies. The 1975 UN resolution equating Zionism, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, to racism stands out as an example of this bias and outright bigotry. And while this was the most notorious illustration of its anti-Jewish sentiment at the United Nations, there have been, sadly, many others. During the 1991 session of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, the Syrian representative to the UN repeated the Damascus blood libel that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood to make matzah. In 1997, the Palestinian representative charged that the Israeli government had injected 300 Palestinian children with the HIV virus. The goals of the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism were undermined by hateful anti-Jewish rhetoric, anti-Israel political agendas, promoting both Israel and the United States to withdraw our delegations from the conference. We don't tolerate anti-Israel and anti-Semitic behavior from radical Islamic Middle East tyrants, and we must not tolerate it at the United Nations, which continues to condemn the righteous and praise the wicked. Enough is enough. We must work together to stop our tax dollars from funding anti-Israel activity and anti-Semitism at and by the United Nations. And in response to the United Nations whimsically named Human Rights Council pattern of anti-Israel behavior, I offered an amendment which enjoyed strong bipartisan support and was enacted into law to prohibit all U.S. aid for this institution, the United Nations Human Rights Council, for last year. America's position must be crystal clear. We will not tolerate glorification of violent extremism and the unyielding anti-Israel rhetoric at the United Nations. I have introduced several measures to prevent any U.S. funding from supporting the so-called Durban II conference, which promises to be filled with as much hatred as the first. This summer, I held a meeting with key countries, officials from key countries, to discuss an alternative to Durban, one rooted in freedom, in tolerance, in democratic values, and our efforts continue. Unfortunately, the United Nations' rapid deterioration as a legitimate structure is not only evident in its approach to human rights, but it is rampant across the entire system. Therefore, to address the broader problems of corruption and ineffectiveness at the UN, I have introduced a bill, the United Nations Transparency, Accountability, and Reform Act, which conditions U.S. funding for the UN on clear, measurable reform of that institution. As a people who value pluralism, who value religious freedom, who value tolerance, it is no coincidence that we have been the targets of choice for extremists. We have seen that where incitement to genocide is advocated, other incendiary and extremist rhetoric flourishes as well. Thomas Jefferson said, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." It is the price of survival as well. With your help, we will maintain that vigilance, and we will help ensure that all freedom-loving people will survive and indeed prosper. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much.